They thought cutting me from a $450 million contract would save them money. The only thing they saved was opportunity. Because the moment I walked out that door, they signed another contract, one that bound them to pay me forever. My name is Isabel Warren, and I used to be the Director of Multicultural Relations at Granite and Fairview Consulting, one of Chicago's premier strategic consulting firms. At 38, I've spent the better part of 2 decades building bridges between American corporations and European manufacturing giants. My father was a career diplomat, my mother a Swiss executive. I learned early that business isn't just about numbers. It's about reading what isn't written in the contracts. The morning Victor Raines walked into our downtown office as the new CEO, I knew my carefully constructed world was about to shift. He came from the financial sector, the type who worshipped quarterly reports and saw human capital as overhead to be minimized. During his first all-hands meeting, he made his philosophy clear. We're here to deliver results, not maintain relationships. I watched from the back of the conference room as he outlined his vision for operational efficiency. Every department would be scrutinized, every role justified by immediate revenue impact. The translation was simple. Anyone who couldn't point to a direct line between their work and the bottom line was expendable. What Victor didn't understand was that my value lay in the spaces between languages, in the cultural nuances that could make or break a deal. For 3 years, I'd been leading negotiations with Brunel Logistics Group, a Dutch conglomerate that controlled 30% of Europe's automated transport market. The contract we were pursuing would revolutionize supply chain management across the Atlantic, $450 million over 5 years, with potential for expansion into Asia-Pacific markets. The morning of our critical presentation to Brunel's executive team, I arrived at the office to find Victor pacing in the conference room. His tie loosened despite the early hour. "Warren," he called out as I passed, "we need to talk." I set down my briefcase and turned to face him. "Good morning, Victor. Is there something specific about today's presentation you'd like to discuss?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's exactly what I want to discuss. This whole charade you've been running with the Europeans. 3 years of your salary, travel expenses, entertainment costs. What do we have to show for it?" "We have a commitment from Brunel to sign the largest logistics contract in the company's history," I replied evenly. "The presentation today is essentially a formality. They're ready to move forward." "According to you," Victor moved closer, his voice dropping. "But here's what I see. An expensive translator who's convinced herself she's indispensable. These Dutch executives speak perfect English. Warren, they don't need you to hold their hands through basic business negotiations." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with being fundamentally misunderstood. "Victor, if you believe that successful international business is conducted simply by speaking the same language, save it." He held up a hand. "I've made my decision. Today's meeting will be my first direct interaction with Brunel's leadership. I want to establish a new dynamic, one that prioritizes efficiency over ceremony." The implication was clear. I was being sidelined on the most important day of a 3-year process. But I'd spent enough time in corporate politics to know when to push and when to step back. "Of course, I'll provide whatever support you need." An hour later, I sat in the corner of our largest conference room as Hendrik Voss, Brunel's CEO, entered with his delegation. Voss was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of measured presence that comes from decades of high-stakes negotiations. His team included Chief Technology Officer Dr. Annelies Bakker and Director of Strategic Partnerships Karl Janssen. I'd worked with these people for years. I knew that Voss preferred his coffee black but would accept cream if offered, that Dr. Bakker collected vintage fountain pens and appreciated when presentations included handwritten notes, that Janssen was a marathon runner who often referenced endurance sports in business metaphors. Victor, however, saw only 3 executives in expensive suits. "Gentlemen," Victor began, standing at the head of the conference table. "Welcome to Chicago. I'm Victor Raines, CEO of Granite and Fairview. I trust your flight was comfortable?" "Quite comfortable, thank you." Voss replied, his English crisp and precise. We're looking forward to finalizing our partnership. Excellent. Let's get right to business. Victor gestured to the presentation screen. I've reviewed the terms you've been discussing with our team, and I believe we can streamline several aspects of the agreement. I watched Dr. Backer's eyebrows rise slightly. In Dutch business culture, diving immediately into contract modifications without proper relationship acknowledgement was considered abrupt to the point of rudeness. Perhaps, Voss said carefully, we might first review the collaborative framework that Ms. Warren has developed. Her understanding of our operational philosophy has been integral to our mutual progress. Victor glanced at me dismissively. Ms. Warren has certainly been involved in preliminary discussions, but I prefer to handle strategic decisions directly. After all, we're all professionals here. We don't need translation services for basic business communication. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I saw Carol Jansen's jaw tighten. Doctor. Backer's fingers paused over her notebook. I see, Voss said, his tone neutral but his meaning clear to anyone who understood the subtle diplomacy of European business. And your perspective on the cultural integration protocols we've established. Cultural integration? Victor laughed. Look, I appreciate that you have certain traditions in your business practices. But at the end of the day, logistics is logistics. Software algorithms don't care about cultural nuances. Dr. Backer leaned forward. Mr. Rains, our implementation strategy specifically addresses the human elements of technological adoption. The workforce transition protocols alone require, which is exactly the kind of overcomplicated thinking that inflates budgets and delays deployment. Victor interrupted. What we're proposing is a straightforward technology transfer. Your systems, our distribution network, shared profits, everything else is just expensive consulting. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the relationship I'd spent 3 years building cracking under the weight of Victor's ignorance. Voss looked directly at me for the first time since Victor's interruption. Ms. Warren, you've been rather quiet today. This is quite different from our previous discussions. Before I could respond, Victor stood up. Actually, that brings up an important point. As part of our operational restructuring, we'll be eliminating several redundant positions. Ms. Warren's role as Director of Multicultural Relations will be discontinued effective immediately. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt my face flush, not from embarrassment, but from a cold, calculating anger I'd learned to control over years of professional disappointments. Effective immediately? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. That's right, Victor said, clearly enjoying his moment of power. Your services are no longer required. I stood slowly, gathering my materials with deliberate care. Then I looked at Voss and spoke in formal Dutch, the archaic business dialect I'd learned from my mother's family. Mijnheer Voss, ik bied u mijn oprechte excuses aan voor deze onverwachte wending in onze professionele relatie. Het spijt me dat de continuïteit van ons samenwerkingsverband op deze manier wordt onderbroken. Voss's eyes widened slightly, not at the Dutch, but at the formality of the phrasing. I was essentially apologizing for the dissolution of our partnership while simultaneously acknowledging that our professional relationship transcended my employment at Granite and Fairview. Dankjewel, Isabel, he replied, using my first name for the first time in 3 years. Your consideration in this matter is deeply appreciated. Victor looked between us, clearly frustrated by the exchange he couldn't understand. Well, that's settled then. Now, shall we return to the contract terms? Dr. Backer closed her notebook. I believe we need to reassess our timeline for this partnership. Given the structural changes in your organization, we should reconvene after we've had time to evaluate the implications. Structural changes? Victor's confidence wavered. This is simply a personnel adjustment. Nothing that affects our core capabilities. Of course, Voss said diplomatically. Nevertheless, we prefer to proceed with full understanding of our partner's operational philosophy. Carol. Please coordinate with our legal team regarding the postponement. As the Brunel delegation filed out, I caught Voss's eye one final time. He gave me the slightest nod, a gesture that spoke volumes about the conversation we'd just had without words. Victor turned to me as soon as the conference room emptied. What did you say to them? I apologized for the interruption to our professional relationship, I replied truthfully. And they postponed the signing because of personnel changes? That's ridiculous. You were just a facilitator. I smiled, and for the first time in months, it was genuine. If you say so, Victor. An hour later, I was in my office, methodically packing my personal items into a single box. 3 years of relationship building, cultural analysis, and strategic planning reduced to a few photographs and a coffee mug from my mother's hometown in Switzerland. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney, Mason Hale. Heard through the grapevine, call me ASAP. I dialed his number while sealing the box with tape. Jesus, Isabel. Mason's voice crackled through the speaker. Victor Rains just fired you in front of your biggest client. That's either stupidity or sabotage. Probably stupidity, but the result is the same, I said, carrying the box toward the elevator. I need you to review my employment contract immediately. Specifically, any non-compete clauses or intellectual property restrictions. Already pulling it up. Give me 30 seconds. I heard keyboard clicking. This is interesting. Your contract is surprisingly clean. Standard confidentiality agreements, but no restrictions on working with competitors or starting your own consulting practice. And here's the kicker. Your knowledge base and relationship network are classified as personal professional assets, not company property. I stopped walking. Are you certain? Absolutely. Whoever drafted this contract assumed you'd never leave voluntarily. They didn't protect against involuntary termination scenarios. Mason, I need to establish a new consulting entity as quickly as possible. What's the fastest timeline for incorporation? In Illinois, if we file electronically today, you could have your LLC established by tomorrow afternoon. What are you thinking? I stepped into the elevator, watching the floors count down toward the lobby. I'm thinking that Victor Rains just made the most expensive mistake of his career. That evening, I sat in my Lincoln Park apartment, surrounded by 3 years of relationship documentation, business cards, meeting notes, cultural analysis reports, communication preferences for over 200 European executives, all legally mine, all invaluable to any company seeking to establish meaningful partnerships across the Atlantic. My laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender was Hendrik, Vosa Brunel Logistics. Com. Isabel. The message read, I hope you understand that our postponement today reflects no lack of confidence in your professional capabilities. If you find yourself available for independent consultation in the coming weeks, we would welcome the opportunity to discuss how we might continue our collaborative work, albeit through different channels. With warm regards, Hendrik. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then picked up my phone and called Mason. It's happening faster than I expected. I told him, can you have the incorporation documents ready by tomorrow morning? What's the company name going to be? I looked out my window at the Chicago skyline, the city lights reflecting off Lake Michigan. Warren Bridge Strategies. By noon the following day, Warren Bridge Strategies was officially incorporated in the state of Illinois. By 5 p.m., I'd received 3 more emails from European executives expressing interest in independent consultation services. By the end of the week, I had my first client. But Brunel wasn't just any client, they were the client. The contract they offered was unprecedented, exclusive strategic consulting for European market expansion, with a focus on what they termed the Warren Method, a comprehensive approach to cultural integration in automated logistics systems. The beauty of the arrangement was its structure. Rather than a simple consulting fee, Brunel agreed to license my methodologies as intellectual property. The initial licensing fee was $2 million years, with annual renewal fees of $500,000 and a percentage of profits from any contracts implemented using my cultural integration protocols. More importantly, The license was exclusive to Brunel for European markets, but left me free to work with other companies in different regions. Within a month, I had inquiries from Nordic transportation companies, German manufacturing firms, and Swiss financial institutions. Victor, meanwhile, was discovering that relationships weren't as easily replaceable as he'd assumed. The first sign of trouble came when Brunel formally withdrew from negotiations with Granite and Fairview. The second sign came when two other European companies canceled preliminary discussions for unrelated projects. The third sign came when the industry trade publication European Business Weekly ran a brief article titled, "When Corporate Restructuring Breaks More Than Budgets." The article didn't mention Victor by name, but it didn't need to. The business world is smaller than most people realize, and word travels fast when a CEO publicly dismisses the cultural intelligence necessary for international partnerships. I was having coffee with Philip Cross, Granite and Fairview's former CFO. When he showed me the article on his phone, Philip had been restructured out of his position 2 weeks after my termination, ostensibly for questioning Victor's aggressive cost-cutting measures. "The board is starting to ask questions," Philip said, stirring his espresso. 3 major European deals postponed or cancelled in 6 weeks. Victor's blaming market conditions, but the timing is hard to ignore. What's the financial impact? Conservative estimate, $15 million in lost revenue for this fiscal year. But the real damage is reputational. Word gets around that you're difficult to work with, and suddenly every negotiation becomes an uphill battle. I nodded thoughtfully. "Philip, I have a proposition for you. Warren Bridge Strategies needs a CFO, someone who understands both the corporate consulting world and the importance of relationship-based business development." Philip raised an eyebrow. "You're growing that quickly?" "Faster than I anticipated. The European market is more receptive to independent consultants than I expected. Apparently, there's value in working with someone who won't be restructured out of a project halfway through." Within a month, Philip had joined Warren Bridge Strategies as CFO and partner. His first task was to structure our rapid expansion into Nordic markets. His second task was to prepare our legal defense against the inevitable lawsuit from Granite and Fairview. The lawsuit came in the form of a cease and desist letter, followed by a formal complaint filed in Illinois Circuit Court. Granite and Fairview alleged that I had violated confidentiality agreements, misappropriated trade secrets, and interfered with existing business relationships. The complaint sought $25 million in damages and a permanent injunction preventing me from working with any companies that had previous or ongoing relationships with Granite and Fairview. If successful, the lawsuit would effectively destroy Warren Bridge Strategies and my career. Mason Hale's response was swift and comprehensive. Not only did he file a motion to dismiss based on the inadequate non-compete language in my original contract, but he also requested discovery of all internal communications regarding my termination. What we found in those communications was better than I could have hoped. The smoking gun came in the form of an email Victor had sent to Granite and Fairview's board of directors 3 days before my termination. The subject line read, "Eliminating GER's redundant European operations." The multicultural consulting division represents a significant cost center with questionable ROI. Victor had written, "European executives are sophisticated business professionals who don't require cultural hand-holding. By eliminating these positions, we can reduce overhead by approximately $400,000 annually while maintaining full-service capabilities. I anticipate minimal pushback from European partners. They're as interested in efficiency as we are." The email was devastating on multiple levels. It demonstrated clear premeditation in my termination, showed a fundamental misunderstanding of international business practices, and most damaging of all, revealed Victor's assumption that European partners would simply accept the elimination of relationship-based service models. Mason leaked the email to the same trade publication that had run the earlier article about corporate restructuring. The resulting piece, titled "The Hidden Costs of Operational Efficiency," quoted unnamed sources familiar with the situation and painted a picture of a CEO whose cost-cutting measures had backfired spectacularly. The article appeared on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Granite and Fairview's stock had dropped 12%, and Victor was fielding calls from increasingly nervous board members. But the real vindication came when Brunel announced their partnership with Warren Bridge Strategies in a press release that emphasized their commitment to culturally intelligent business solutions. The announcement specifically mentioned the licensing of proprietary methodologies for cross-cultural implementation of automated systems, methodologies that were now legally and exclusively mine. The licensing arrangement I'd negotiated with Brunel was more sophisticated than even I had initially realized. Not only did they pay for the right to use my cultural integration protocols, but they also agreed to pay a percentage of profits from any project that implemented these methodologies. Given that Brunel was expanding rapidly into new markets, this created a revenue stream that would continue long after the initial consulting work was complete. More importantly, the license included a clause that automatically renewed annually unless either party provided 12 months written notice. This meant that as long as Brunel continued to find value in my methodologies, which they clearly did, the payments would continue indefinitely. When Mason called to inform me that Granite and Fairview wanted to discuss a settlement, I was sitting in my new office overlooking the Chicago River, reviewing contracts from 3 new clients. They're offering to drop the lawsuit in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. Mason explained, no admission of wrongdoing, no financial penalties, but you agree not to discuss the circumstances of your termination publicly. What about the licensing arrangement with Brunel? That's where it gets interesting. They're not challenging your right to license your methodologies to new clients, but they want to discuss licensing those same methodologies back to Granite and Fairview for their European operations. I almost laughed. They want to pay me for the knowledge they claimed was worthless when they fired me? That's exactly what they want, and given their recent performance in European markets, they don't have much choice. They've lost 4 major contracts in the past 2 months, and their European division is hemorrhaging clients. The irony was perfect. Victor's cost-cutting measure had eliminated a $150,000 annual salary and created a situation where Granite and Fairview would need to pay millions in licensing fees to access the same expertise. The final settlement negotiation took place in a conference room at Mason's law firm. Victor attended with Granite and Fairview's general counsel and outside litigation attorney. I brought Mason and Philip, who had become increasingly valuable as both CFO and strategic advisor. Victor looked older than I remembered, his confidence replaced by the drawn expression of someone who had made a very public mistake. He avoided eye contact as the attorneys outlined the terms. My client is prepared to dismiss all claims. Granite and Fairview's attorney began. In exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement and a licensing arrangement for the cultural integration methodologies currently being used by Warren Bridge Strategies. What licensing terms are you proposing? Mason asked. Standard industry rates for consulting methodologies. Perhaps a one-time fee of $500,000 for perpetual licensing rights. I looked at Philip, who had prepared for exactly this moment. He slid a document across the table. These are the current licensing terms for Warren Bridge methodologies, Philip said. Brunel Logistics pays an annual license fee of $3 million, plus a percentage of profits from implemented projects. The license is renewed annually and includes exclusive rights within their designated market sectors. The room fell silent as the Granite and Fairview team reviewed the document. $3 million annually. Victor spoke for the first time since entering the room. That's 20 times what we paid you in salary. The value of these methodologies has been established by market demand, I replied calmly. If Granite and Fairview had recognized that value initially, we wouldn't be in this position. The final agreement took 3 weeks to negotiate. Granite and Fairview agreed to pay Warren Bridge Strategies an annual licensing fee of $3 million for the right to use my cultural integration methodologies in their European operations. The license would be reviewed annually, with automatic renewal unless either party provided 6 months written notice. The agreement also included a non-disclosure clause that prevented both parties from discussing the specific circumstances of my termination, but did not restrict either party from discussing the licensing arrangement itself. Most importantly, the license was non-exclusive, meaning I remained free to license the same methodologies to other companies, including direct competitors of Granite and Fairview. 6 months after my termination, Warren Bridge Strategies had 12 employees, offices in Chicago and Amsterdam, and annual revenue approaching $15 million. The licensing agreements with Brunel and Granite and Fairview provided a stable foundation, while new client relationships in Germany, Switzerland, and the Nordic countries created additional growth opportunities. Victor Rains resigned as CEO of Granite and Fairview 4 months after our settlement. The official reason was strategic differences with the board regarding international expansion priorities. The unofficial reason was that his restructuring initiatives had cost the company over $40 million in lost contracts and damaged relationships. I learned about his resignation from Philip, who maintained relationships with several former colleagues at Granite and Fairview. The board hired a new CEO with extensive European experience, Philip told me over lunch. Her first initiative was to rebuild the multicultural consulting division that Victor eliminated. How's that working out for them? Slowly. Relationships that took years to build aren't easily replaced. Most of their former European partners are now working with other firms, many of them with us. The real measure of success, however, wasn't in the failure of my former employer. It was in the sustainability of what I'd built. Warren Bridge Strategies had evolved beyond simple consulting. We were now a full-service firm specializing in culturally intelligent business solutions, with clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies to mid-sized European manufacturers. Our methodologies had been implemented in over 30 countries, generating revenue streams that would continue for years. The licensing model I developed with Brunel had become the industry standard for intellectual property monetization in international consulting. Other firms were approaching us about licensing our methodologies for their own use, creating additional revenue opportunities. But the most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was the letter I received from Dr. Anneliese Bakker, Brunel's Chief Technology Officer, on the 1-year anniversary of my termination. Dear Isabel, she wrote, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your patience and professionalism during what must have been a difficult transition. The cultural integration protocols you developed have exceeded all expectations. Our employee satisfaction scores have improved by 30%. Our implementation timelines have been reduced by 20%, and our client retention rates are at an all-time high. More importantly, our workforce feels valued and understood in ways that pure technological solutions could never achieve. Your understanding that successful business is fundamentally about human relationships has transformed not just our operations, but our entire corporate culture. I framed the letter and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what happens when you recognize that people, not just profits, drive sustainable success. The morning I received Dr. Bakker's letter, I also received a text message from an unknown number. Coffee sometime this week? HV, Hendrik Voss. Even after a year of working together, he maintained the formal distance appropriate to our professional relationship. A request for coffee meant something significant was developing. We met at a small cafe in the Loop, away from the business district where we might be recognized. Hendrik arrived precisely on time, as always, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested this was more than a social conversation. Isabel, he said, settling into the chair across from me. I have a proposition that I believe will interest you. I'm listening. Brunel is expanding into the Asia-Pacific market, not just logistics, but comprehensive supply chain management solutions. The cultural complexities are even more challenging than our European-American integration. He opened his portfolio and withdrew a document that was easily 50 pages long. We would like to license your methodologies for the Asian expansion, but we're also interested in something more comprehensive. A partnership. I scanned the first page of the document. It was a joint venture proposal outlining the creation of a new division within Brunel, specifically focused on culturally intelligent business solutions. Warren Bridge Strategies would maintain its independence while providing exclusive strategic guidance for all of Brunel's international expansion efforts. The financial terms are outlined beginning on page 12. Hendrik continued. But the essential structure is this. Warren Bridge Strategies becomes the strategic consulting partner for all Brunel international operations. In exchange, you receive equity in the new division. ongoing licensing fees, and a percentage of profits from all international contracts. I looked up from the document. Hendrik, this is essentially an acquisition offer disguised as a partnership. Not an acquisition, he corrected. A recognition that the most valuable business relationships are built on mutual benefit and shared success. You've demonstrated that cultural intelligence isn't just a consulting service. It's a core competency that drives sustainable competitive advantage. The terms outlined in the proposal were staggering. An upfront partnership fee of $10 million, annual licensing fees of $5 million, equity stake in the new division, and profit-sharing arrangements that could potentially generate tens of millions in additional revenue. But more than the financial terms, the proposal represented validation of everything I'd built. Brunel wasn't just licensing my methodologies, they were integrating them into their core business strategy. There's one condition, I said, closing the document. I maintain the right to work with other clients outside of direct competition with Brunel's operations, already included in Section 4. Hendrik smiled. We have no interest in limiting your ability to grow Warren Bridge strategies. Competition makes us all better. That afternoon, I called Philip and Mason to review the proposal. Philip's analysis was characteristically thorough. The financial projections were conservative. The legal structure protected our interests, and the growth potential was unprecedented. Mason's review focused on the contractual language and exit clauses. This is essentially a marriage contract, he concluded, but it's a marriage between equals, with clear prenups and mutual respect built into every clause. The signing ceremony took place in Brunel's Amsterdam headquarters, a modern glass building overlooking the harbor. The entire Brunel executive team attended, along with representatives from Warren Bridge Strategies and legal counsel from both organizations. As I signed the final page of the partnership agreement, I thought about the path that had led to this moment. A year ago, I'd been dismissed as an expensive translator. Today, I was signing a partnership agreement that would make my cultural intelligence methodologies the foundation for a multinational corporation's global expansion strategy. But the most significant moment came after the ceremony, when Hendrik pulled me aside for a private conversation. Isabel, he said, I have a confession to make. The day Victor Raines dismissed you from that meeting, we had already decided to sign with Granite and Fairview. Your cultural protocols were valuable, but they weren't the deciding factor. I felt a momentary chill. What changed your mind? The way you handled that dismissal, the grace under pressure, the respect you showed for everyone in the room even while being publicly humiliated, the way you apologized in formal Dutch, not for your performance, but for the disruption to our professional relationship. That told us more about your character and your understanding of business relationships than 3 years of presentations ever could. He paused, looking out at the harbor. Victor Raines showed us who he was that day. But more importantly, you showed us who you were. We didn't postpone the signing because of personnel changes. We postponed it because we realized we were about to partner with the wrong person. The partnership with Brunel exceeded all projections. Within 6 months, Warren Bridge Strategies had offices in Singapore, Tokyo, and Sydney. The Asian expansion generated more than $50 million in new contracts for Brunel, while the licensing and profit-sharing arrangements provided Warren Bridge with a revenue stream that would continue as long as the partnerships remained successful. The methodology I developed for European-American business integration proved remarkably adaptable to Asian markets. The core principle that successful business relationships require deep understanding of cultural contexts and communication styles was universal, even if the specific applications varied by region. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Harvard Business School requested permission to develop a case study around the Warren Bridge Strategies model, specifically focusing on how cultural intelligence could be monetized as intellectual property. The case study, titled When Cultural Intelligence Becomes Competitive Advantage, was eventually published in the Harvard Business Review and became required reading in several MBA programs. The article's conclusion captured the essence of what I'd learned. The Warren Bridge case demonstrates that in an increasingly global economy, cultural intelligence isn't a soft skill. It's a core business competency that can generate sustainable competitive advantage and measurable financial returns. 2 years after my termination from Granite and Fairview, I received an unexpected phone call from Victor Rains. Isabel. His voice was different, less confident, more reflective. I wanted to call and, well, to acknowledge that I made a mistake. I was in my Amsterdam office, reviewing contracts for our latest expansion into South American markets. Victor, I didn't expect to hear from you. I'm sure you didn't. I left Granite and Fairview, as you probably know. I've been doing some consulting work, smaller firms mostly. It's given me time to think about what went wrong. What went wrong was that you confused cost with value, I said, not unkindly. But that's a common mistake in business. Is it? Because it seems to me that what I eliminated was exactly what those companies needed most. The human element, the relationships, the understanding that business isn't just about algorithms and profit margins. There was a long pause. I could hear traffic noise in the background, suggesting he was calling from a car or perhaps walking on a street. Isabel, I have a request. I'm working with a firm that's trying to establish partnerships in Eastern Europe. They're making the same mistakes I made, assuming that cultural differences don't matter in the modern business world. Would you be willing to consult with them? Not as a favor to me, but because they need what you do. The request was both surprising and oddly satisfying. Not because Victor was admitting his mistake, but because he was acknowledging the value of what he'd dismissed. Send me their information, I said. I'll have my team evaluate whether we can help them. Thank you. And Isabel, I want you to know that I've learned something from all of this. Success isn't just about making the right decisions. It's about understanding the consequences of the wrong ones. The firm Victor had mentioned became a client, and their Eastern European expansion was ultimately successful. But more importantly, the conversation with Victor reinforced something I'd come to understand about revenge in the business world. The most effective revenge isn't about destroying your opponents. It's about succeeding so completely that your opponents become irrelevant. Victor's mistake had created an opportunity for me, but my success wasn't dependent on his failure. It was built on the foundation of providing real value to clients who understood the importance of cultural intelligence in global business. 3 years after my termination, Warren Bridge Strategies had become the preeminent cultural intelligence consulting firm in the world. We had offices on 4 continents, partnerships with major corporations across dozens of industries, and a methodology that had been implemented in over 100 countries. The licensing agreements that had started as a way to monetize my expertise had evolved into a comprehensive intellectual property portfolio. Companies were paying annual fees not just to use our methodologies, but to access our cultural intelligence databases, our training programs, and our ongoing research into global business practices. The original licensing agreement with Granite and Fairview had been renewed 3 times, each time at increased rates reflecting the growing value of our methodologies. The current annual fee was $5 million, with additional payments based on the success of their European operations. But the most satisfying aspect of the business wasn't the financial success, it was the impact. Our cultural intelligence methodologies had been used to facilitate partnerships between companies that might never have found common ground otherwise. We'd helped American manufacturers understand Japanese quality protocols, enabled German engineers to work effectively with Brazilian production teams, and facilitated joint ventures between companies from cultures that had historically been skeptical of each other. The letter from Dr. D. Bakker had been the first of many similar communications from clients who recognized that our work was about more than just business efficiency. We were building bridges between cultures, creating understanding where there had been suspicion, and demonstrating that diversity of perspective was a competitive advantage rather than an obstacle to overcome. On the 4th anniversary of my termination, I was in my Chicago office, preparing for a presentation to a Fortune 100 company that was considering a major expansion into African markets. The complexity of the project was unprecedented. 15 countries, 12 languages, and dozens of distinct cultural and business traditions that would need to be integrated into a coherent operational strategy. My phone buzzed with a message from Mason Hale. Saw the article in the Financial Times about Warren Bridge's African expansion. Remember when you were worried about paying my legal fees? Good times. I smiled and opened the Financial Times article on my laptop. The headline read, Cultural Intelligence Firm Leads American Expansion into African Markets. The article described Warren Bridge strategies as the gold standard for culturally intelligent business solutions and quoted several executives who credited our methodologies with the success of their international operations. But the quote that caught my attention came from an unnamed European executive. Working with Warren Bridge isn't just about avoiding cultural mistakes. It's about discovering opportunities that you never knew existed. They don't just help you do business in other cultures. They help you understand why those cultures might choose to do business with you. That afternoon, I received a call from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who was writing a feature article about the monetization of cultural intelligence in global business. She wanted to interview me about how I'd built Warren Bridge strategies and what lessons other professionals might learn from my experience. The story seems to be about more than just business success, she said during our phone conversation. There's an element of vindication, of proving that something your former employer dismissed as worthless was actually invaluable. That's one way to look at it, I replied. But I prefer to think of it as a story about recognizing value where others see only cost. The cultural intelligence that Victor Reigns dismissed as expensive translation services was actually the foundation for sustainable competitive advantage in global markets. Do you think he understood that when he terminated you? I think he understood exactly what he was doing. He was eliminating what he saw as an unnecessary expense. The problem was that he didn't understand the difference between an expense and an investment. The Wall Street Journal article was published the following month with the headline, The $450 Million Mistake: How One CEO's Cost-Cutting Created a Competitor. The article detailed the circumstances of my termination, the subsequent success of Warren Bridge strategies, and the ongoing licensing relationship with Granite and Fairview. But the article's most interesting revelation came from unnamed sources at Granite and Fairview who provided financial details about the impact of Victor's restructuring. According to these sources, the company had lost over $200 million in European contracts following my termination, and their attempts to rebuild their multicultural consulting capabilities had cost an additional $50 million in recruitment, training, and failed partnerships. The article's conclusion was particularly pointed. The irony of the Warren Bridge case is that Granite and Fairview now pays more in annual licensing fees for Isabel Warren's methodologies than they would have paid to keep her as an employee for a decade. What Victor Reigns intended as a cost-saving measure has become one of the most expensive personnel decisions in modern corporate history. The day after the article was published, I received a call from Hendrik Voss. His voice carried an unusual note of excitement. Isabel, have you seen the inquiries we've received since the Wall Street Journal piece? I've been monitoring our website analytics. Traffic is up about 400%. It's more than traffic. We've received formal partnership inquiries from companies in Brazil, South Africa, India, and Indonesia. They're not just interested in consulting services, they want to license the Warren Bridge methodologies for their own regional operations. The implications were staggering. Instead of expanding Warren Bridge strategies through direct service delivery, we could license our methodologies to regional partners who understood their local markets. This approach would allow for rapid global expansion while maintaining quality control through our proven frameworks. Hendrik, I think we need to schedule an emergency strategy session. This could change everything. The strategy session took place via video conference the following week, with participants from our offices in Chicago, Amsterdam, Singapore, and our newest location in São Paulo. The agenda was straightforward: how to manage sustainable growth in response to unprecedented demand. Philip presented the financial analysis first. Based on current inquiries, we could potentially triple our revenue within 18 months through strategic licensing partnerships. But we need to be careful about quality control and brand protection. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, our newly hired Director of Global Operations, had conducted a comprehensive analysis of the inquiring companies. Most of these firms have strong regional expertise but lack frameworks for cultural integration. They're essentially looking to license our methodology while contributing their local knowledge. which creates an interesting reciprocal value proposition. I added, we license our frameworks while gaining access to their cultural intelligence databases. Everyone benefits from the expanded knowledge base. The conversation continued for 3 hours as we developed a new business model that would transform Warren Bridge Strategies from a consulting firm into a global network of cultural intelligence partners. Each regional partner would license our core methodologies while contributing their local expertise to a shared knowledge platform. The financial projections were remarkable. Instead of linear growth through direct service delivery, the licensing network model could generate exponential returns while creating barriers to competition that would be virtually impossible to overcome. But the most exciting aspect wasn't financial. It was the potential impact. A global network of cultural intelligence partners could facilitate international business relationships on a scale that no single consulting firm could achieve. 6 months later, the Warren Bridge Global Network was officially launched with founding partners in 12 countries across 5 continents. Each partner paid an initial licensing fee of $2 million, followed by annual fees of $500,000, and revenue-sharing arrangements based on their regional performance. The launch event took place simultaneously in all 12 partner cities, connected by video conference that allowed participants to see the global scope of what we'd built. Representatives from over 200 multinational corporations attended various sessions, creating networking opportunities that extended far beyond our specific services. During my presentation at the Chicago session, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 4 years ago, I was told that cultural intelligence was an unnecessary expense in modern business. I said, looking out at an audience that included executives from companies across dozens of industries. Today, we're launching a global network that will make cultural intelligence accessible to any organization that recognizes its value. The lesson isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about understanding that in a connected world, the ability to build relationships across cultural boundaries isn't just valuable, it's essential for sustainable success. The applause that followed wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was recognition from business leaders who understood that they were witnessing the launch of something that would fundamentally change how international business was conducted. The most gratifying moment came during the networking reception, when a young woman approached me with a business card that identified her as Director of International Partnerships at a technology company I'd never heard of. Ms. Warren, she said, I wanted to thank you for creating a model that proves cultural intelligence can be monetized. I've been trying to convince my board for 2 years that our international expansion failures were due to cultural misunderstandings, not market conditions. Your success has given me the evidence I needed. What's your next step? I asked. We're applying to become a Warren Bridge Network partner. Our focus is Southeast Asian technology markets, and we need frameworks for cultural integration that go beyond language translation. Send me your application materials. I'd be interested to learn more about your specific challenges. As she walked away, I realized that the Warren Bridge model had evolved beyond my original vision. We weren't just providing cultural intelligence services, we were creating a movement that recognized cultural understanding as a core business competency. The success of the global network exceeded all projections. Within the first year, network partners had facilitated over $2 billion in international contracts, with success rates 40% higher than industry averages for cross-cultural business partnerships. The methodologies that had started as my personal approach to European-American business relationships had been adapted and refined for dozens of different cultural contexts. Each network partner contributed their local expertise while benefiting from the collective knowledge of the entire network. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Harvard Business School invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual Global Business Conference. The theme of the conference was Cultural Intelligence as Competitive Advantage, and my presentation would be broadcast to business schools around the world. Preparing for the presentation forced me to articulate what I'd learned over the past 5 years. The transformation from dismissed employee to global entrepreneur hadn't been about revenge. It had been about recognizing and monetizing value that others had failed to see. The morning of the presentation, I stood in Harvard's iconic Burden Auditorium, looking out at an audience of 800 business leaders, academics, and students. My presentation was titled, From Termination to Transformation: Building Sustainable Value from Cultural Intelligence. 5 years ago, I began. I was terminated from my position for being an expensive translator. Today, the methodologies that were dismissed as worthless generate over $50 million in annual revenue and facilitate billions of dollars in international business partnerships. The difference wasn't in the value of what I was providing, the difference was in how that value was perceived and monetized. I walked through the journey from individual consultant to global network, emphasizing the key decisions that had transformed cultural intelligence from a support service into a core business strategy. The lesson for all of us is this: value doesn't disappear when it's not recognized. It simply finds new ways to express itself. The companies that succeed in our global economy will be those that understand cultural intelligence isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about discovering opportunities that exist only when different perspectives come together. The presentation concluded with a case study of a recent Warren Bridge network project that had facilitated a joint venture between American, German, and Japanese companies. The project had taken 18 months to complete and generated over $300 million in revenue for all three partners. This partnership wouldn't have been possible without frameworks for cultural integration, I explained. Not because the executives couldn't speak the same language, but because they needed to understand how their different cultural approaches to decision-making, risk assessment, and relationship building could complement rather than conflict with each other. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but the moment that meant the most came during the question and answer session when a student asked about the role of revenge in business success. Ms. Warren, he said, your story seems to be about proving your former employer wrong. How important was that motivation in building Warren Bridge strategies? I paused, considering how to answer honestly without oversimplifying the complex emotions involved in the journey. Revenge suggests that success is measured by your opponent's failure, I replied. But Warren Bridge Strategies wasn't built to destroy Granite and Fairview. It was built to provide value that the market clearly needed. The most effective response to being undervalued isn't to prove someone wrong, it's to prove yourself right. Victor Reigns didn't fail because I succeeded. He failed because he made decisions based on incomplete understanding of what creates value in international business. My success came from recognizing that same value and finding better ways to deliver it. The student nodded thoughtfully. And I realized that this distinction was crucial for anyone facing similar challenges. Success built on revenge is ultimately hollow because it depends on external validation. Success built on value creation is sustainable because it depends on meeting real market needs. After the presentation, I was approached by representatives from 3 major business schools who wanted to develop partnerships with the Warren Bridge Network. They weren't interested in case studies or guest lectures. They wanted to integrate cultural intelligence methodologies into their core curricula. We're seeing increasing demand from corporate recruiters for graduates who can navigate cross-cultural business relationships, explained Dr. Geesey Jennifer Walsh from Northwestern's Kellogg School. But traditional MBA programs don't adequately prepare students for these challenges. What kind of partnership are you envisioning? I asked. Curriculum development, certification programs, and practical training using real Warren Bridge client projects. We want to graduate students who understand that cultural intelligence is as important as financial analysis or strategic planning. The conversation continued over dinner, where I learned that business schools around the world were recognizing cultural intelligence as an essential skill for 21st century business leaders. The challenge was developing curricula that went beyond theoretical cultural awareness to practical frameworks for building successful cross-cultural partnerships. By the end of the evening, we had outlined a preliminary agreement for Warren Bridge to develop cultural intelligence certification programs that could be implemented across multiple business schools. The programs would combine academic theory with practical application, using real client projects to give students hands-on experience with cross-cultural business challenges. The university partnerships represented a new phase in the evolution of Warren Bridge strategies. Instead of simply providing services to existing businesses, We were helping to shape the next generation of business leaders who would understand cultural intelligence as a core competency from the beginning of their careers. 6 months later, the Warren Bridge Cultural Intelligence Certification Program was piloted at 5 business schools across the United States and Europe. The program combined online coursework, case study analysis, and practical projects where students worked directly with Warren Bridge network partners on real business challenges. The results exceeded all expectations. Students who completed the certification program received job offers at significantly higher rates than their peers. And corporate recruiters began specifically requesting candidates with cultural intelligence training. But the most meaningful feedback came from the students themselves. Many reported that the program had fundamentally changed how they thought about business, helping them understand that success in a global economy required more than technical skills and financial acumen. One student's evaluation captured the essence of what we were trying to achieve. This program taught me that cultural intelligence isn't about political correctness or sensitivity training. It's about recognizing that different cultures bring different strengths to business relationships, and the most successful companies are those that know how to leverage those differences as competitive advantages. 5 years after my termination from Granite and Fairview, I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the International Association of Management Consultants. The conference theme was The Future of Consulting in a Global Economy, and my presentation would address how cultural intelligence was reshaping the entire consulting industry. The invitation was particularly meaningful because the association represented the most established consulting firms in the world, including Granite and Fairview. My presentation would essentially be a professional homecoming, though under very different circumstances than when I'd left the industry. The night before the presentation, I had dinner with Philip Cross, who had become not just my business partner, but one of my closest advisors. We were sitting in the restaurant of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, the same building where I'd had my final meeting as a Granite and Fairview employee 5 years earlier. "It's ironic, isn't it?" Philip said, raising his wine glass. 5 years ago, you were fighting to save a single consulting relationship. Tomorrow, you'll be talking about transforming the entire industry. "I don't think I was fighting to save anything," I replied. "I think I was fighting to prove that what I was doing had value, even if that value wasn't recognized at the time. And now? Now I understand that recognition isn't something you can force. It's something you earn by consistently delivering results that matter to people who understand what value looks like." The next morning, I stood before an audience of 1,200 consulting professionals, many of whom worked for firms that had once viewed Warren Bridge Strategies as an upstart competitor. The presentation was titled Cultural Intelligence from Support Service to Core Strategy. "The consulting industry is experiencing a fundamental shift," I began. "Clients are no longer satisfied with solutions that work in theory, but fail in implementation due to cultural misunderstandings. They want consultants who can navigate the human elements of business transformation, not just the technical ones." I presented data showing that consulting projects with integrated cultural intelligence components had success rates 60% higher than traditional approaches. More importantly, these projects generated long-term client relationships that extended far beyond the initial engagement. The Warren Bridge Network model demonstrates that cultural intelligence isn't just a nice-to-have service. It's an essential capability that can differentiate consulting firms in an increasingly competitive market. During the question and answer session, a partner from a major consulting firm asked about the scalability of cultural intelligence services. "How do you maintain quality control when you're licensing methodologies to partners around the world?" she asked. "The same way any professional service firm maintains quality," I replied. "Through rigorous training, ongoing certification, and continuous feedback loops that ensure our methodologies are being implemented correctly." "But cultural intelligence seems so subjective. How do you measure success?" Cultural intelligence becomes subjective only when it's treated as sensitivity training rather than business strategy. Our methodologies are built around measurable outcomes, project success rates, client satisfaction scores, employee engagement metrics, and ultimately, financial performance. When cultural intelligence is properly implemented, The results are quantifiable and sustainable. Companies don't continue paying licensing fees for methodologies that don't deliver measurable value. The presentation concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Warren Bridge Institute for Cultural Intelligence, a research and training center that would advance the academic study of cultural intelligence while providing professional development for consultants across all industries. The institute represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about transforming cultural intelligence from a support function into a strategic capability. It would offer research fellowships, professional certifications, and consulting methodology development that would benefit the entire industry. But more importantly, the institute would ensure that the lessons learned through Warren Bridge strategies would outlast any individual consulting firm or business leader. Cultural intelligence would become a permanent part of how business professionals approached global challenges. The response to the institute announcement was overwhelming. Within a week, I received inquiries from consultants at over 50 firms who wanted to participate in certification programs. Universities expressed interest in research partnerships, and multinational corporations requested information about custom training programs for their internal consulting teams. The most significant response came from the International Association of Management Consultants itself. They invited Warren Bridge Strategies to develop cultural intelligence standards that could be adopted across the entire consulting industry. "What you've built is bigger than any single firm," explained Dr. Robert Chen, the association's president. "These methodologies need to become industry best practices, not competitive advantages for one consulting network." The invitation to develop industry standards represented both an opportunity and a challenge. Sharing our methodologies broadly would accelerate the adoption of cultural intelligence across the consulting industry, but it would also eliminate much of our competitive advantage. After extensive discussions with the Warren Bridge Network partners, we decided to accept the challenge. Our competitive advantage had never been in hoarding knowledge. It had been in implementing that knowledge more effectively than anyone else. The development of industry standards took 18 months and involved consultants from over 30 countries. The resulting document, Cultural Intelligence Standards for Management Consulting, was adopted by the International Association of Management Consultants and became required training for certified management consultants worldwide. The standards didn't eliminate Warren Bridge's competitive advantage, they enhanced it. As the organization that had developed and refined these methodologies, we became the natural choice for companies that wanted to implement cultural intelligence at the highest level. More importantly, the standards ensured that cultural intelligence would become a permanent part of professional consulting practice. Future generations of consultants would understand cultural intelligence as a core competency, not an optional specialty. 7 years after my termination from Granite and Fairview, I received an invitation that brought the entire journey full circle. The Chicago Business Council was presenting me with their International Business Leadership Award, recognizing Warren Bridge Strategies' contribution to Chicago's position as a global business hub. The award ceremony was held at the Palmer House Hotel, in the same ballroom where I'd attended Granite and Fairview's annual client appreciation dinner as a junior employee nearly a decade earlier. As I prepared my acceptance speech, I reflected on the path that had led from that first dinner to this moment. The journey hadn't been about revenge or vindication. It had been about recognizing that value exists independent of recognition, and that the most sustainable success comes from creating solutions that meet real market needs. The ballroom was filled with Chicago's business elite, including executives from companies that had become Warren Bridge clients, partners from our global network, and leaders from consulting firms that had once viewed us as competitors but now collaborated with us on major international projects. But the guest who meant the most to me was Mason Hale, my attorney who had guided the legal strategy that protected Warren Bridge Strategies during its most vulnerable period. He was seated at the head table with Philip Cross and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the core team that had transformed a termination crisis into a global business opportunity. 7 years ago, I began my acceptance speech. I learned that being undervalued by one organization doesn't diminish your actual value. It simply creates an opportunity to find organizations that recognize what you bring to the table. Warren Bridge Strategies wasn't built to prove anyone wrong. It was built to prove that cultural intelligence could be a sustainable competitive advantage in global business. Tonight's recognition isn't just for our company, it's for every professional who has ever been told that their specialized knowledge wasn't valuable enough to justify their position. The most effective response to being underestimated isn't revenge, it's excellence. Excellence in recognizing market needs, excellence in developing solutions, and excellence in building relationships that create value for everyone involved. I paused to look out at the audience, recognizing faces from various stages of Warren Bridges' development. The businesses that succeed in our global economy will be those that understand that diversity of perspective isn't a challenge to be managed. It's an asset to be leveraged. Cultural intelligence isn't about political correctness or sensitivity training. It's about recognizing that the best solutions come from combining different ways of thinking. And the most successful partnerships are built on mutual understanding rather than mutual accommodation. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. But the moment that meant the most came during the reception afterward. When a young consultant approached me with a question that reminded me why this work mattered. "Ms. Warren," she said, "I'm working with a client who's struggling with a joint venture in Southeast Asia. The technical aspects are solid, but the relationship dynamics are falling apart. How do you help executives understand that fixing the relationship is more important than optimizing the contract terms?" "You help them understand that relationship problems become financial problems," I replied. "When partners don't trust each other, they spend more time protecting their interests than pursuing shared opportunities. When they don't understand each other's decision-making processes, they make assumptions that lead to missed deadlines and budget overruns. Cultural intelligence isn't about making people feel better. It's about making businesses work better." She nodded thoughtfully. And I realized that this conversation represented the true measure of Warren Bridges' success. We hadn't just built a profitable consulting firm, we had helped create a generation of business professionals who understood that cultural intelligence was essential for sustainable success in a global economy. As the evening wound down, I stood on the hotel's balcony overlooking downtown Chicago, the same city where my career had been derailed and ultimately transformed. The lights of the business district stretched toward Lake Michigan, representing thousands of companies that were navigating the complexities of global commerce. My phone buzzed with a message from Hendrik Voss. "Congratulations on the award. Looking forward to discussing the South American expansion next week." HV. I smiled and put the phone away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new partnerships. But tonight was for recognizing how far we'd come from that conference room where Victor Rains had dismissed me as an expensive translator. The most satisfying aspect of the entire journey wasn't the financial success or industry recognition. It was the knowledge that Warren Bridge strategies had fundamentally changed how businesses approached cross-cultural partnerships. Companies that might have struggled for years to establish international relationships were now succeeding, because they understood that cultural intelligence was a strategic capability, not a support service. The licensing agreements that had started as a way to monetize my expertise had evolved into a global network that facilitated billions of dollars in international business partnerships. The methodologies that had been dismissed as worthless were now industry standards that were taught in business schools around the world. But the most important transformation was personal. I had learned that success isn't measured by proving your critics wrong. It's measured by building something that creates value for people who understand what value looks like. As I headed home that night, I passed the building that had once housed Granite and Fairview's Chicago office. The consulting firm still existed, though under different ownership and with a completely rebuilt international division. Victor Rains had long since moved on to other ventures, and the company had evolved beyond the cost-cutting philosophy that had defined his tenure. There was no satisfaction in their struggles, just as there was no resentment for the challenges they had created. Warren Bridge strategies had succeeded not because Granite and Fairview had failed, but because we had recognized and responded to market needs that extended far beyond any single consulting firm's limitations. The licensing agreement between our companies continued, renewed annually at rates that reflected the ongoing value of our methodologies. It was a business relationship based on mutual benefit rather than past grievances, Exactly the kind of partnership that cultural intelligence was designed to facilitate. Standing outside that building, I realized that the story had come full circle, but not in the way I might have expected 7 years earlier. The ending wasn't about revenge or vindication, it was about transformation. The termination that had seemed like a career-ending catastrophe had become the catalyst for building something far more significant than anything I could have achieved within the constraints of a traditional consulting role. They thought cutting me loose would save them money. Instead, they had created a competitor who understood their market better than they did, and who had built a business model that turned their short-term cost savings into their long-term competitive disadvantage. The most expensive personnel decision in modern corporate history had become the foundation for an industry transformation that would benefit businesses around the world for decades to come. As I walked toward my car, I thought about the young consultant who had approached me at the reception. She represented the next generation of business professionals who would inherit a world where cultural intelligence was recognized as essential rather than optional. That was the real victory, not defeating Victor Reigns or outperforming Granite and Fairview, but creating a legacy that would outlast any individual success or failure. Cultural intelligence had evolved from a specialized consulting service to a fundamental business capability. And that transformation would continue long after Warren Bridge strategies had been succeeded by the next generation of innovative consulting firms. The contract they thought they were cutting had indeed been terminated. But the contract they had unknowingly signed, the one that bound them to pay for the value they had failed to recognize, would continue as long as businesses needed to build bridges across cultural boundaries. And in our increasingly connected world, that need would only continue to grow.